Welcome to Conversations with the Wits Journal of Clinical Medicine. This is our audio-video interview, and welcome Francois. I've known Francois for a very long time. He's a professor at Wits, and he's currently the divisional director at Ezintsha, and he's extremely knowledgeable on immunology as well as many viruses. We're going to go back to the mask story, and the debate is closely, and in fact it's often a divisive question. How does the virus travel through the air and spread infection? Is there evidence base for transmission patterns for the virus?
So, the TB world provided us with a lot of basics, and in fact there's a whole TB dispersion unit based in Cape Town that gave us a lot of background. And South Africa was one of the first countries to firmly recommend masks, months before the WHO did. And to my mind, there's a whole history there that was a real misstep. But as the information around the transmission of the coronavirus, the culture wars that the Americans have brought to bear on masks, as well as this huge kerfuffle about aerosolization versus dispersal and all the rest of it. The bottom line is the TB people, and I think most South African clinicians, got it very quickly, which is that you need to disperse this thing and you need to have sunlight. There was data within the first few weeks that sunlight is highly cidal for the virus, and that just opening windows and doors is an incredibly powerful thing in terms of dispersing it. What we didn't know was how important the surface spread is, and with every passing week, there hasn't been a proper dispersal transmission case from a surface. So it's very clear it's in the air. And the way, I think, again, what we were trying to explain to the general population when I was on the Ministerial Advisory Committee and with all of these public health people is open the doors and windows. If you get forced inside, try not to crowd. And if you are crowded, wear a mask because it buys you time. So if you were going to get the virus in 10 minutes, maybe you'll get it in 20. So these kind of practical things actually made it quite easy for us to plow through the culture wars that have been going on in the last year in the scientific community. I think where it got a little bit edgy was with the N95 masks and this level of risk. And I think that's where a lot of the HIV training came in, because I actually felt like the condom wars in the old days. People say you must have zero risk tolerance with coronavirus. And to do that, you kind of live underneath your bed with an N95 mask for the rest of your life. We know that's not possible. You have to allow the society to start opening up. How do you do it as safely as possible? And the same with the HIV thing is like, people are going to have sex. How do you make it as safe as possible? And those culture wars are still going on, both internationally and locally. But I actually think in many ways the South African expertise we had in the public health department helped us have a more rational recommendations. Whether we implemented them is a different story.
Yeah, just for the viewers, Francois and I are not wearing masks, but we both have been vaccinated a few months ago, and there's a social distance of at least 2 to 3 meters between us. So that's the reason we're not wearing masks for this interview. Francois, it has been advocated that the masks are important, but in the resource settings that people, especially our environment, wear cloth masks. Are these good enough for the general public?
It appears so. The N95 mask would be ideal, but there's a certain comfort level, although I've probably, like you and most healthcare workers, very little sympathy with that argument. When I see some of the sort of anti-coronavirus weirdos out there carrying on about how uncomfortable and people passing out, surgeons wear these things all the time. And where we work in infectious diseases, we have multi-drug resistant. You wear them for hours at a time. There is gradations of protection that come from the N95 to the cloth mask. It seems like any form of masking is probably better than nothing. But how much time it buys you? Probably an N95 mask. If you would have got the virus in 10 minutes, it'll buy you 2 hours. If you've got a cloth mask, maybe it'll only buy you 15 minutes. So it's useful for me to think about that. And I'm sure everyone has seen 17 different versions of a cloth mask. People have got over their mouth, over their nose, their T-shirts wrapped around their faces. It really does depend. But the average surgical mask actually provides a huge amount of protection, it appears.
And if you're kind of worried about it, does double masking is more effective than a single mask?
Probably. There was some worrying data around double masking that showed, there was one study that seemed to demonstrate more dispersal with double masking. And it's because when you cough into it, it kind of goes sideways. I think we're kind of splitting hairs here. If you're in a situation where you're really worried about it, the mask is really useful for going into a crowded store, going to the cell phone store, which is small and with 5 or 6 people you don't know. It's going to buy you time to get done as pretty much with close to 100% safety, as long as you're in and out there within 20 minutes. So that's where the masks are useful. Family gatherings where you're a little bit overcrowded and it's not maybe as the windows are not as open as they probably should be. I think we've all been in those situations where you just feel a little bit uncomfortable. That's where masks come into their own. But honestly, in the average environment, I think particularly for South Africans in sort of middle income, high income areas, you're not going to be wearing masks 95% of the time.
Good. Now, so we've got our vaccine rollout ongoing. Do you see the days of mask wearing will become behind us?
Yes, I think that's increasing. There's a big debate about how much immunity is actually conferred by the vaccine and by natural infection. Everything I've seen, including reports from this week, demonstrate that that's long-lasting, that you're at least you're probably going to have lifetime protection to some degree. You may need booster vaccines. That's the big debate. And obviously the pharma industry is very invested in you getting as many vaccines as possible. But there is a fair amount of data to suggest that that we have at least 1 year of almost complete protection. There may be people who do break through. I have one colleague who's been admitted twice now with COVID who only goes vaccine after the second one. So there are some unlucky, but he's got lots and lots of risk factors. So there are some luckless people who won't be completely protected, but the vast majority of the evidence we have is this virus is going to be circulating forever, and that you're going to get it eventually. And it's whether you get it vaccinated or unvaccinated, that's the difference. And if you get unvaccinated, you're rolling a very small dice with very few sides. So I think that the vaccine is a modern miracle. They all look pretty good. There's some concerns about 2 of the vaccines at the moment that are circulating, but they'll get ironed out. But all the vaccines available in the country are really effective.
So if you're vaccinated, basically you think we should not be wearing masks other than that sort of 14 to 21 day period after vaccination?
Yeah, look, it seems like there's data that actually again came out yesterday demonstrating that it takes about 6 months for the full efficacy of the vaccine to kick in. And there's now a big debate as to whether we can mix and match. So having 2 different vaccines might accelerate that. And that's all very exciting. It'll play out in the next few years with the immunologists and the vaccinologists playing on that stuff. But I think we're looking at a future where everything's back to normal, and probably it's going to take a few years. The people who refuse to get vaccinated, or who can't get vaccinated, are going to be with us. In fact, we're going to be wearing masks, you and I are vaccinated, to protect them, not the other way around. We are going to probably get the virus over and over again several times in our lifetime, just like all the other coronaviruses. You just get a bit of a sore throat and a runny nose, you're down for a day or 2, and that's your booster. As I said, there is a debate as to whether booster vaccines will be required for you and me going forward, but there's a good chance they won't, and we'll just sort of carry on getting it over and over again. The problem is the people who don't get the vaccines and the very vulnerable. They're the ones who are going to roll that dice, and they're going to get it in the next little while. The only way they're not going to get it is to hide behind closed doors for the rest of their lives.
So, to digress a little bit, we're into our 3rd wave of infections in this country. And what are your views and what we as a country need to do next?
So to my mind, what the country should have done from March last year, rather than go through these city lockdown periods, is limited indoor gatherings as much as possible. That's what they should have done. And then the mask mandates for indoors. That we've done pretty well as a country. The indoor stuff, not. And they should have been working on making the taxi industry and the bus industry as safe as possible. Anything where people are congregating indoors is where these spreading events are happening. The kind of obsession with surfaces and thermometry, which we know jolly well doesn't work, is misdirecting people and what they should have been doing. So if I was president for the day, I would have just put that in place in March last year and said, no gatherings, this is how you protect yourself, and spent a lot more money and effort in trying to educate people. Restaurant owners and taxi owners, they don't want to kill you. They want their customers to come back. Educate them as to why keeping the windows open is so important. I was at a restaurant last night, and the restaurant owner has gas heaters everywhere. but the windows all open. Honestly, we could have been outdoors, which, as I said, there's no super spreading event that's been documented outdoors. Outdoors is there have been a handful of cases internationally where outdoor transmissions actually happen. So it's much, much safer to be there than indoors. In terms of your question about the third wave, there's interesting stuff because the first and the second wave is very different from province to province. Gauteng was very similar between the first and the second wave, while the Western Cape was hammered in the second wave, but in different places along the Garden Route, not in Cape Town proper. And what we're seeing at the moment in the third wave is the Northern Cape and the Free State are having levels 2-3 times what they had in the first and the second wave. Gauteng is well on its way to eclipsing the first and the second wave, and we're seeing that at the moment with ICU starting to fill up and hospitals starting to come through. So I think that we, at the moment, seeing very much a pattern of 6-monthly spreads in South Africa, but the pattern within provinces is actually quite different.
All right, so we're going to keep on getting these waves. So the answer is an effective vaccination program, isn't it?
Yeah, and that is very frustrating to me to watch because at the moment, as of yesterday, we're vaccinating about between 50 and 70,000 people a day. And that's, to give credit to where it's due, the people doing the vaccinating are heroes and they are working hard, and every report I get is of people going to pick up old people in their cars to bring them to the vaccination sites. The problem is there's just not enough vaccination sites, and I think this is where my HIV experience comes in, is that when I saw them, what they were proposing, which is 200,000 vaccines a day, you have to have the infrastructure in place to drive that. You need people to understand almost a Fordist approach, how to, almost to manufacturing, rather than a whole lot of dippy researchers and people who are like used to 1,000 people. To drive those volumes through a site like that, you really need proper expertise. Unfortunately, we're doing 60, 70,000 a day last week, when we should have been doing 180,000. Those 120,000 that we didn't vaccinate get kicked into the next group, and that number per day gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So I'm very worried about the vaccine program at the moment. We all see social media, your auntie and your cousin photographed at the vaccination sites, but the problem with it is that we're just not going fast enough. We need more sites, and we also need to make it much easier to get the vaccine. One of the visions I remember seeing in America was these drive-thrus where people just stick their shoulder out the window and get the jab. And that's actually what I think we should be looking at, is at the taxi ranks, particularly in places like Gauteng, where the majority of people use taxis every day, is to start making it just easier to get it.
So, we have significant barriers to vaccination. One is just availability of vaccines, cost, but more is the infrastructure in getting the vaccines out to the public.
Look, I think procurement was a big challenge and still remains a challenge. We are being drip-fed by the pharmaceutical companies making the vaccines. And, they could not be in a bit more powerful position because every country is coming to them to try and buy. And South Africa unfortunately made some bad decisions around which vaccines it was going to use. Also came very late to the party. I think there was a real sense that we're so big we can just put up our hands and they would come banging on our door. And as I said, every other country was in exactly the same position. But at this point, I think the infrastructure to deliver the vaccines is actually a much bigger challenge than actually procuring them. It sounds like the procurement people have got their act together and there seems to be vaccines flooding in. But the numbers walking through the door is way too low.
How do we kind of conscientize the public to try and get more people coming to the vaccination? It appears that we have enough vaccines to vaccinate people, but we're just not getting enough people to come through. Is it a messaging problem?
I think it's partly a messaging problem, but I also just think it's hard to find out. Germany's scheduling and appointment system collapsed. And if Germany can't get it right, why are we so invested in these appointment systems? To my mind, they should, certainly in places like Gauteng, they should have these massive sites where people can come in, they can drop in, they know they're going to be there for 15, 20 minutes max. And they probably should have them at the major taxi ranks, just grab people. Initially we do need to have an age cutoff because we don't have quite enough vaccines. But if anyone walks through the door and has any form of identification that suggests that they're over the age of 60, just vaccinate them. Get on with it. Don't make such a palaver of it. I've heard lots of people saying, oh, but what if they need to travel? We're not vaccinating the country so people can get on an airplane. We're vaccinating them to stop them dying in hospital. And also, there's also how do you have proof of vaccination that people don't come back a second time? If people are that, why worry about that? Just, if if 10% of the population is so neurotic that they're going to get an unnecessary vaccine, which I find very difficult to believe, let's so be it. Then we say that's 10% less. At the moment, the fact that we're not vaccinating the vulnerable in huge numbers is much more worrying to me than the fact that that people might be abusing the system.
Yeah, so taking this forward, it appears from the government that we probably will be getting sufficient numbers of vaccines, and the J&J vaccine, for whatever it's being held up, I mean, that should be flowing in once the approval process is through. So I don't see a vaccine number of an issue. You think we could vaccinate, if we get our act together, enough people by the end of the year to get out of this troubled spot?
We do. I did see a very troubling message that the last 2 weeks, only 10% of the vaccinations happen in the private sector. And they've been relied on by the Department of Health heavily to get this up and running. If we are going to do, again, I'm reminded of HIV, where it was a Department of Health problem, and there was tons of bureaucracy attached to ARVs being rolled out, and we had to fill in so many forms, and it was a palaver from left, right, and center. And it took us 18 years to even get, we're still not quite there, but we're close to getting to the 90% zone that we've all been told about is going to give us epidemic control, which is actually working. We have to do this, and we should have been doing this in the last 4 months, is setting up these mass vaccination sites in places that suit patients, don't necessarily suit us always. And we need the messaging, as you say. We need to get people very, very clear messaging in terms of it. But we've got 400 sites at the moment operating, and they said it'll be 600 as of today. I was working out that each site is going to be doing more vaccinations than we have done in the healthcare worker studies per site than any site. So we had to get several, I think I worked out 400 or 500 vaccinations per day. The busiest sites during the Sasonke trial, when you and I were vaccinated, was getting that. So we just have to do this 5-fold bigger. It's that silly.
All right, so Francois, thanks so much for those insights. Just one final question, since you're the HIV expert. I did publish some early work from Charlotte to suggest that despite the doomsday view about HIV patients and COVID, it did not appear that the HIV patients were really more susceptible to COVID than the general public. But no, your view?
No, you're right, and you guys were one of the first people to actually put the data forward. We've also got very good data systems from Cape Town. There seems to be a very small increase in mortality rates with HIV positive people, but it's the same mortality rate you see between men and women. Men are more likely to die than women with COVID. So the risk is there, it's just not nearly as severe as we thought. I mean, we were terrified, you can imagine another virus coming into a country where there are 6 million people on ARVs. There are also theories about tenofovir, one of the ARVs giving protection. That seems to be nonsense. So I'm very reassured, and certainly in the tightly monitored clinical trials we have been running, we haven't had a single fatality yet with the HIV patients. So that is one small aspect of good news. We also haven't seen it with the TB patients, where there's a small increase in mortality, but it's been the same as everywhere. It's been the obese patients, the diabetics, the hypertensives who've been hammered.
So your closing message to say we need to get our vaccination strategy correct to overcome this problem?
I tell my family, my friends, everyone who listens to me, survive the third wave and get vaccinated, because that's the path to a normal life. I honestly think we'll have South Africa back to where it was. We're going to be repairing the economy for the next decade and two, by the looks of things. But if we can just get through this, once you've been vaccinated, the protection is so great that you can pretty much get back to normal. Whether we need top-up vaccines, we'll have that debate. And as I said, the immunologists and the vaccinologists will give us that data, probably in the next year or so.
Okay. So we'll end this interview. Thank you, Francois, for those fascinating insights into the corona pandemic in South Africa. And thank you very much again.
No, thanks for the invitation. It's lovely to see you guys.